Welcome to History 1302. This is a lecture on the Gilded Age and the mentality of the elite of the Gilded Age in the post-Civil War era. As we begin our lecture today, one thing we need to consider is what was the Gilded Age. So far we've talked about how the Gilded Age was the rise of corporations and what all that meant for the worker and for society at large. We've also talked or lectured on the immigration to the United States, the great changes, the great modernization of the United States. We've gone through a litany of changes that are occurring in the afterwash of the Civil War. Excuse me. But you would think that because of the Civil War, there would have been a great confidence in the United States, especially in the northern portions of the country, after that great conflict. And that was true in some areas. But however that may be, the Civil War also produced a great deal of skepticism and pessimism and really cynicism in its elite statuses. The Civil War as a whole was one of the most profound transforming events in the history of the Republic, the United States. Obviously, it killed a lot of people. We've gone through all that in this course. But beyond that, it's going to have a long legacy, not just on the men who fought it, but on the nation as a whole. One of the things it's going to do is going to shatter the confidence of those who fought in it, particularly those who were coming out of the elite stock of society. I make this point more often than I have in the past, especially in the 1301 course, but here in 1302, it's always important to remember who is in the elite portions of society, those who go to Harvard and to Yale, and those who go to other premier institutions, come out of premier families, come out of Boston on Brahman Hill, who come off of out of New York City, off of the Tony and elite parts of New York City. Washington, D.C. in a sense as well, maybe later especially, but certainly even in the 19th century, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and so on. Those folks who come and end up eventually going into the Ivy Leagues or other universities of that sort of stature, they're going to play an inordinately large role in the outlook and the thinking and the direction of society compared to the rank and the file. To say it a little differently, to use a boxing term, they punch over their class. They're small in number, but big in influence. And it shouldn't surprise us if you look at it today, who make up most of your governors and senators, members of the U.S. House of Representatives, U.S. Supreme Court, justices on the appellate jurisdictions and the circuits, district courts, and on I can go. Those men come from the Ivy Leagues. Today, it's almost unheard of, it seems like, that a person who did not go to an Ivy League law school could be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And on down the list we can go. It's a rather extensive list all the way around. But the fact of the matter is that for some of the men, in fact, maybe many of the men who will be leaders of the United States in the post-Civil War era, they themselves were less than confident coming out of the Civil War. So the Civil War has a great dramatic change that's going to take place, and it affects many people. One of the most cynical individuals, an observer who himself is not often associated with elite society, though he moved in it quite freely, was Mark Twain, a.k.a. Samuel Clemens, the great writer. We know him for Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and so on, but he was also a newspaper writer, a jaded and sometimes keen observer of society, and he and one of his friends, Charles Dudley Warner, are going to refer to society in the post-Civil War era as the Gilded Age. Excuse me, I guess I've got some of that stuff going around. I don't know. We'll see. But the Gilded Age itself is not exactly is not meant to be a term of a compliment. The Gilded Age was a slur and a cynic's crack at what American society had become in the post-Civil War era. It was gilded with a patina of society was gilded with a patina of gold. Yet at the same time, you're also going to see society be within the underneath the patina or the covering of gold. It will be as cold and as dead as a lead block, unfeeling, empty, just ugly. And that's what they meant by that Gilded Age. Perhaps an example might be the unloveliness of a Walmart store or Home Depot, both of which I frequent from time to time when I'm not recording exams, rather recording lectures. But the fact of the matter is just perhaps some of the buildings on the Texas A&M campus, for those of you who are watching this, maybe the Blinn campus, you know, those very economical, very utilitarian, but just frankly aesthetically not very pleasing setups. And Twain and Warner and others had a lot to say about society. In fact, actually, they take a dim view of all society. One of the individuals you've heard me mention before is a guy named Henry Adams. Henry Adams was a descendant of that Adams family, the very first, one of the first families of the Republic. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Charles Francis Adams, Henry Adams, and on we can go. But Henry Adams, he is going to not make a name for himself as a politician like his ancestors did, or as a founding father or whatever. He's going to make a name for himself as a writer. And one of the individuals that Adams is just going to absolutely hammer on is the Grant administration. And Ulysses S. Grant, as I've said to you before, was not a particularly adept administrator. He was a good general, frankly a great general. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the Grant administration, it is historically known, and it was known in its time period as an administration barnacled with much corruption. As I've said before, Grant himself was not a corrupt man, but many of the people around him, to one degree or another, were corrupt. And so when we talk about that, it's always fair to remember that Adams is going to comment upon, say, in this case, the Grant administration, and he has no respect for it. One of the things Adams says about the Grant administration, he says, quote, "It was a corrupt, visionless, and helpless Grant himself was inarticulate, uncertain, distrustful of himself, still more distrustful of others, and awed by money. Grant could have lived in a cave and worn skins," unquote. That is not exactly a great compliment paid to the man who, outside of Lincoln, probably was more responsible to saving the United States from disunion than anybody. Yet there were many in elite circles, especially the more jaded elements, who thought very poorly and thought very lowly of Grant and his administration for much of what we've studied already to this point. And so one of the things that's worth remembering, too, is that this genteel elite, these thinkers and these doers who come out of the Ivy Leagues and come out of elite sectors of society, you would have thought they might have been proud to be an American. In a sense, perhaps they still are. But were they proud in the fighting of the Union Army? And in some respects, the answer comes back in a surprisingly way, as the answer is no. They don't. You will look at them and they will say, what was it that caused the North to win? It wasn't by heroism. It wasn't by determination, valiant cavalry charges or anything like that. What caused the North to win? That thing that made them gilded and what made the North kind of cold and bloodless. It was that issue of the economy. The North was this gigantic, monolithic, in their minds, monolithic blob that had industrial capacity. It was cold, it was mechanical, it was the worst of all worlds, and it just beat the lives out of the Southerners. And in a strange way, you see some of these Northern elites, like a Henry Adams and others, who are going to come out and almost take the line that who were the real knights and who were the real brave men of the Civil War, and who were the ones who fought and were most human. It wasn't the Northerner, it wasn't the Northern soldier, it was not anything up north, it was the Southerner. And so part of the reason that that lost cause mythology gets going and really takes hold in the country, not just because of the building of statues that I've referenced earlier in the semester, not just because of how you taught your children down south, that has a part to play. But you even see the mythology of the great General Robert E. Lee. And by the way, I think pretty highly of him as a general. I think he was a very good general for what he had to work with. However, the idea of the great General Lee, the sainted one, the almost marvel man that you sometimes see brought forward, You also see that take hold in the work of Northerners, the Adamses of the world, and even Holmes and a few others. Point is this, is that Robert E. Lee, Southern soldiers, these farmers, these yeomen, these earnest young men who are fighting for ideals and hearth and home and come out of nothing, and they put up a valiant fight against in this lost cause, this unwinnable war against this monolithic, gigantic, unbeatable Northern juggernaut. And so therefore they have, there's a lot of respect and in fact almost really mythology that grows up from the North around Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and some of these other characters that are to this day still prominent names in the Civil War, lore. So Grant the butcher, Grant the barbarian, Grant the primitive versus the genteel, refined Southerner who is just fighting for the best of causes. Now, mind you, some of these men would not have said they wanted to see the South leave or anything like that, but at the same time, it takes on a strange and odd relationship. Well, anyways, that's part of the story with this bleak landscape that is out there. So we have this negative mentality the Civil War brings on, that the future of the United States may be bright in a sense economically, but money was, for some of these individuals, again back to an Adams and again to others, money is not the only thing that can be measured. In fact, maybe if you rely too much on money, it is a damning quality, not a good quality. A second thing that you'll notice, too, about the afterwash of the Civil War is there are two really major developments as well in the mindset and the thinking of Americans after the Civil War. It wasn't just that the Civil War was a horrible, horrible event. But the fact of the matter is that the Civil War also produced a randomness, and so this randomness of the Civil War can be explained like this. You probably have heard it described as survivor's guilt. Why did I survive and others not? In, say, in a car accident, an earthquake, or something else. You saw that in the Civil War. And so why did I, in making the charge at Gettysburg's, Pickett's charge, and this would be from a Southern perspective, or why did it going up Malvern Heights at the Battle of Fredericksburg, why did I survive and many of my comrades either get shot or killed? Why did I survive Lee's camps and not get sick, whereas others, well, they didn't? And that's again to the Civil War. And the answer for some, especially in the rank and the file, still is going to be it was God's blessing, God's providence, God's protective hand over top of us. You will see, and this gets to a second issue in this Civil War period and this post-Civil War period, is the issue of religion. In a 1301 class, I bring up religion quite regularly, and I make a heavy point about it and a major emphasis about it in 1301 history. However, if you had me for 01, you've now noticed probably in 1302, I haven't talked religion all that much. I've downplayed it, and I have on purpose. Not to say, and as I have said in class before, not to say that Civil War soldiers weren't religious. Most of them were, to one degree or another, very religious. Some were going to become very devout during the war, being so close to death, whether it being on the virus or disease side that we've discussed, or in the context of battle and seeing bullets fly and cannon boom. That can drive a man's mind to thinking about what happens when I die. And there will be many, many American soldiers, Confederate or Union, who are going to be very devout coming out of the Civil War, are going to gain their faith or have their faith bolstered by the Civil War. They were fearful, and there's nothing wrong with being fearful in the face of grave danger. And so they sought solace in religion. Christianity particularly, still more so in 1860s America. We're talking Protestant Christianity, like Methodism and Baptist, two denominations, for example. And you can say Presbyterian and others. But all that to say, though, is that you will have many who are going to be religious. And so one thing I want you to remember is that coming out of the Civil War and the post-Civil War era, people don't quit going to church. I don't want you to think, oh my gosh, everybody quit going to church and they all became atheist or agnostic or whatever. That's not true. You can look at the statistics. It's clear that there's still a very vibrant and large place for faith in and amongst the rank and file Americans in the post-Civil War era, regardless of whether you were a Yankee or whether you were a Confederate. But That is not to say that the religious landscape of the United States is unchanged. In the post-Civil War era, one of the things you start to notice is that for some, religion starts to take a back seat. You can see this in the society, particularly amongst the elites, but you can also see this in people who were very religious going into the war. The war tended to, at times it seemed like, to foster upon two mindsets. You really weren't ambivalent about these sorts of things. You couldn't say, well, I don't know. It seemed like, at least in my amateurish reading of the Civil War, is that either you came out of the Civil War with a stronger faith, particularly in a Christian sense, because most were Christian. The fact of the matter was, or you came out of it with a lesser faith, maybe a greatly reduced, if non-existent faith, or just something that perhaps there is a God and there's not much more to say than that. You weren't, I guess you could say, agnostic completely. You were really one or the other. It tended to drive the event, tended to drive people one way or the other. So, and this particularly seems to be true amongst the elite. And when I started out talking about how the elite have an influence on society, this is where I'm coming into it again. Again, it's true today, it's true back then. Those who go and come from Boston, or in a modern sense Los Angeles, out of the right neighborhoods and the right areas, come out of perhaps the right parts of Dallas, use a Texas example, certainly New York and so on, Chicago, those guys are going to have an inordinate influence on society. And with regard to religion, part of the thing that helped drive a wedge in faith, and this is where I would say where you start to see, at least in one facet, why does religion, particularly Christian religion, start to lose its hold on the United States? And I think it does. If you were to press me and say historically, what happens to religion in the United States, I think it starts to erode coming out of the Civil War. It's not the only story. We'll get to that as we go through this, but I think that's part of it. So, and by the way, I'm clear about this. I'm a believing Christian. I'm a Baptist, amongst other things. But at the same time, I try to be honest about what I see historically. The thing is that what happened is that for those who fought in the Civil War, it was a traumatic experience, and for those who seemingly lost their faith, or at least lost the fervency and the zeal of their childhood faith, it was a jarring example, a jarring thing. In the case of, here's a prominent man, his name is James Garfield. James Garfield was a lay Baptist minister prior to the Civil War. And he fought and became a general in the Civil War. He was a soldier. He was from Ohio. That's a theme that'll be raised up in future lectures, and I've already said it in class prior to the break. But the fact of the matter is that when we talk about James Garfield, General Garfield of Ohio, he was a lay Baptist minister, and one of his lifelong, up to that point in time, practices was regular and fervent prayer. He was a devout man. But as he said himself, and let me see if I can find the quote here before me. I think I can without too much issue. Yeah. Anyways, this is Garfield talking to William Dean Howells after the war, that the sight of, quote, dead men whom other men had killed, something went out of him, the habit of his lifetime that never came back again, the sense of sacredness of life and the impossibility of destroying it. It's one part randomness. Another part might be the fact of the matter is that life isn't as precious as sometimes we like to think. There is an Illinois surgeon named John Hostetter who, and a lot of these guys, by the way, are going to keep memoirs and letters, and the war itself produced a whole bevy, a mountain of paper, whether in the form of books or letters or journals, about what it was like to go through the conflict. And so I always encourage those who have a little interest in writing, even if it's just for themselves, please keep a journal. It's good for the historian, and it's good for society, and probably good for you too. But John Hostetter said this about the Civil War. He said, and he was a surgeon for the Union Army out of Illinois, he said, "There is no God in war. It is merciless, cruel, vindictive, unchristian, savage, and relentless. It is all that devils could wish for." Anyways, another New Jersey surgeon said this, don't have his name in front of me, he said, "It is hard and very hard for one to retain his religious sentiments and feelings in this soldier life. Everything seems to tend in different direction. There seems to be no thought of God, of their souls, etc. amongst the soldiers." And again, I would push back against that last quote a little bit, is because I see too much evidence elsewhere. But there were many people who could argue, who would echo that and say that there was a lack of faith. Like I said, I pushed back against it because you see in letters and actions and such that there was. So, but at the same time, it's a confusing time period. And back to the issue of randomness is, how did I survive? Why did I survive? And then some would say it was God's protective hand over me, and so on. Others would say, no. It was just all random and an accident. And so one of the things I think it does, especially amongst the genteel elite, the elite of society that fought in the Civil War. And of course, I did mention in class that there were many who bought their way out of the Civil War and were not touched personally by it, at least not in a direct put your life on the line sort of way. But many didn't. Many did put their neck out. They, especially up north, many of those Bostonians who went to Harvard, they went and fought. An example, put this man in your notes, like some of these others, would be Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He fought in the Civil War as part of the Harvard Regiment. He saw combat. He was wounded multiple times, and he was never quite the same again. Even when he died, they found in his house, he was a U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice in the 20th century, toward the end of his life. Holmes is going to, if you open the door to his closet, which people did when they cleaned out his apartment or his house after his passage, they found his Civil War uniform hanging, or a couple of them hanging in his closet with notes saying, "This is where I was shot. This is my blood." It was an event that they never forgot, and it ruined or challenged, in some cases wrecked, the religious faith of the elite. And so these would be your Presbyterians, and these would be your Episcopalians. These would be, in some cases, your Catholics. But understand this, when we talk about these individuals, and occasionally Methodists and Baptists too, is that when we talk about the elites, you found them in New England in the Unitarian Church, or you found them in the Congregational Church, you found them in Episcopal churches, you found them in the denominations of Protestant America. You will find them in different parts of society, and especially the elites will be in the Episcopalians, and some Presbyterians, and some Congregational, and if you already kind of loose in the faith, the fact of the matter is you might find yourself Unitarian before the war. A Unitarian would be somebody who does not believe in the Trinity of the Bible, or the Trinity creed that the church has pushed for and believed in for many, many years. But you also will notice, too, in the coming of the Civil War, something else, or rather the Civil War's afterwash, something else that's pretty important, is that the Civil War is going to produce a massive change amongst the elite and amongst particular segments of society regarding the establishment of colleges and universities. Again, if you've had me for 1301, I make a very clear point that in the pre-Civil War era, I joke about it with a quote of, there were three great scourges of mankind: doctors, lawyers, and preachers. But in the post-Civil War era, the doctors and the lawyers continue their influence and gain esteem. I mean, right now, we think very highly of the doctors, and we applaud their efforts, and we pray for greater effort, obviously. But the fact of the matter is, when we talk about the lawyers, as I have said to you before, it was true in the 19th century before the Civil War. It's true in the 18th century, frankly, and it's especially true today. If you desire a place and a seat amongst the elites of your community and society, go be a lawyer. That's one of the easiest and most well-trod paths to prominence in the United States to this day. That's not true about the preacher anymore. I'm reading, as I record this, I'm reading a book about the settlers of Ohio, written by David McCullough a year or so ago. And as Manasseh Cutler is the preacher's name, Manasseh Cutler was memory serves, a congregational minister from Massachusetts at the late 18th century, so the late 1780s, basically. And he's one of the chief proponents of the Northwest Ordinances, which is going to help settle, amongst other states, Ohio. But he was a preacher, amongst other things. He was a dabbler and a tinkerer. He's a lot like, if you remember me talking about Cotton Mather and the smallpox epidemic that he is going to try to arrest and to promote inoculation. you see all that take the place. The fact of the matter is that when we talk about, say, Manasseh Cutler, he had influence and he lobbied hard the Continental Congress and later President Washington and the U.S. Congress, as we understand it today, for the establishment and the bolstering of the Northwestern Ordinance and the establishment of Ohio and other states in that area. But that was prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, you see the idea of the preacher being a public leader recede in areas, especially amongst the elites. Again, as I keep coming back to, this is not a true statement across the boards. In 1880, Americans did not quit going to church. They did not quit asking their preacher for advice. Now, that all to say, though, is that if you reflect on where you are at the time of this recording in March of 2020, the fact of the matter is that some of you recording this have never sought the advice of a pastor or a clergyman of any stripe, regardless of denomination, religion, or what have you. You've never sought his advice on anything beyond, at most, church itself or a church or faith matter. In times gone by, in the 19th century, where we are for this lecture, many men and women would ask the advice of a pastor on this, that, or the other. Maybe it's simply because the pastor had read more than most. And maybe he was also because the pastor, was esteemed as a man of wisdom who could give good advice and good counsel. But that starts to change in the late 19th century, in the post-Civil War era, and especially starts to change amongst the elites. You don't see that affection and that esteeming of the pastor's advice nearly as much as you once had before the Civil War. And I think the Civil War is going to have a fairly major impact on that as well. So several other things that are worth noting here, how times are changing and how religion and the church, particularly now back to Protestant Christianity, is starting to slowly but now starting to perceptibly recede in the elite esteem of thinking. Prior to the Civil War, I make a point about this when I talk about the Great Awakening, and I could do it elsewhere as well. The great founders of universities and institutions of higher learning, not just lower secondary education, but like a high school or something like that, but the great establishers of universities prior to the Civil War, as some of you know because you had me, was the church. I mean, for an example, Harvard or Yale or Brown or Princeton, and on and on and on I can go. All those were established and were church institutions prior to the Civil War. It depends on when they were established, depends on whether you find them at the time of the Civil War, but they were established by the church. Especially in the early days, like a Harvard and Yale, was designed not to establish and produce scientists, but to produce preachers. They were preacher colleges. Yale was established in the early 1700s as a rebuttal against Harvard's liberalism, and so on. So, and on top of that, prior to the Civil War, the Ivy Leagues were generally led by these colleges established as nurseries of piety. These church schools, these church universities that we recognize today as Ivy Leagues, they were led by almost exclusively by preachers. You needed to have a reverend in front of your name. You needed to be an ordained man. You might be a Yale man. You might be a graduate of that college. Depends on the exact person, depends on the circumstances. But pretty much every president of these colleges was himself a preacher. After the Civil War, that starts to break down and that starts to change rapidly. And the reason that happens has to do with something that also will play into this course as we go throughout the semester. And one of the things that we sometimes, even to this day, deal with as an afterwash of the World Wars is this idea that the Germans were barbarians. They were primitive thugs who just slaughtered people wantonly. Now, we obviously know in the Second World War especially, that is the part about the slaughtering of people, that is clearly true. The Holocaust is a real deal. The murdering of thousands and thousands of civilians, not in the strict speaking of the Holocaust, but German occupation in the Second World War is true. But to say that the German people or German society was backward, primitive, and unlettered, that is not true at all. That is historically false. In fact, in the post-Civil War era, now back to on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, in the post-Civil War era, American higher education did not look to England or France so much for guidance anymore, but in the post-Civil War era, in the 1870s, in the 1880s, and the 1890s, American higher education looked to the Germans for guidance. It was Germans that are going to give us the great universities. And in fact, if you look at it from a religious perspective, it's going to be the Germans who are going to give us what's called German higher criticism. Basically, the idea that the Bible isn't quite what it says people have said it to be. Talk about that in a later lecture. But the fact of the matter is that when we talk to say about German education, one of the things that American universities are going to start to adopt, and new universities that are spawned to model itself, are going to model itself on the German way, which is going to put an emphasis amongst other things, more so on science and math and the hard, the STEMs, if you like, as we now call them. The STEM was that science, technology, engineering, and math, I guess, I suppose. But anyways, the hard sciences. Some of you watching this are engineers. I talk about that on the first day. But the fact of the matter is that when we talk here in a lecture on the late 19th century, Americans are going to look to the Germans as the model to follow. And again, Germany's not backward. They have a higher per capita literacy rate than the United States or basically any other European nation. Their standard of living is higher. They have a social safety net that the other European nations and the United States does not have. On and on and on. Germany is considered to be an avant-garde, the advanced element of a progressing civilization. And so what you see with the model, the German university model, is the idea of science and observation. But anyways, oh, by the way, I should say this also, just glance at a note that I almost forgot to bring in. Our best students in the post-Civil War era, thousands of them, not millions of them, but thousands of them, but the best of the best. Many of them will go to Germany to study in the great German universities in the 1870s and so on. But two things that the Germans are going to push. One is called Lernfreiheit, and the other is Lernfreiheit. I'll try to spell those and send it out in an email, but Lernfreiheit, I'll just do it here very slowly but clearly. Learn is spelled Lernfreiheit. And that means a student has the freedom to study at will. So in a sense, that is kind of like a hyper elective system. You want to be a engineer? Well, you pick your mode of study. You don't have just a rote set of, okay, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. So there's this idea of the elective, I would argue, is what Lernfreiheit is. But secondly, you also have this second idea. It's called Lern, and I may not be pronouncing it quite right because German is not, even though I'm descended out of a German family, German is not my native tongue anymore. It hasn't been in my family for 100 years now at this point. But Lernfreiheit is freedom of the professor, now me, to project the vision for the discipline. And for me, that would mean, in this sense, I have a great leeway to teach, in this case, a survey course in much the fashion I choose. Whereas if you take my class, you see in 1301, for example, I emphasize religion, I emphasize politics, and I emphasize war. And of course other things too, but those are the three big ones for me. Whereas a colleague of mine in the same college, in the same department, and so forth, may press and push for maybe racial history, economic history, whatever the case may be, intellectual history. But there's that Lernfreiheit, and Lernfreiheit, the freedom of the professor to cast his vision for the discipline, as it were, is pronounced or spelled Lehfreiheit. So, those are the two dominant principles within the new and emerging American higher education system. Lernfreiheit and Lernfreiheit. And maybe I mispronounced them horribly in both cases. So, what universities follow that model? And that's where we start to come to a close today for this little segment of lecture. The one who's the first real American university that follows on the German model of science and STEM and so forth. Some of you may even applied there, or at least maybe you got a friend who went there. Especially for those of you who come out of the accelerated and the real heavy science types. It's the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1876. That is the first of the great American universities that are going to be based off of the German model. But a second thing, too, to note that mixes this German model of higher education with good old-fashioned American money. And you've actually seen, if you've been paying attention and been thinking about what I've lectured on already this semester, what I've already said in this lecture, you will already, for some of you, you've already noticed this. Who was it that establishes universities in the post-Civil War era that I've mentioned already? You think about it with the railroad lectures in Texas that I mentioned several weeks, almost now, maybe almost like a month ago it feels like, but weeks ago. But the fact of the matter is that I talked about a town called Rice, and most of you have already know William Marsh Rice. He was a railroader, and he produces and builds endows Rice University of Houston, a great higher institution of learning. Over in North Carolina, James Buchanan Duke is going to endow and give a whole lot of money to a Methodist college that really becomes more just simply a secular university. Now we know it as Duke University. That's tobacco money. I think, again, back to the railroading and going out west, some of you are very familiar and maybe applied for Stanford University. It's named after Leland Stanford. It was actually not named after Leland Stanford. It's named after or given as a memorial to the dead son of the great railroad baron, Leland Stanford. And then next up, you're going to also see other colleges that are going to be established by wealthy men. Some are prominent names, some you've heard of, some maybe not, but they all will be established and endowed by robber baron money or plutocrat money or just wealthy men money. Ezra Cornell of Western Union is going to endow the name of Cornell University in 1865. I already mentioned Leland Stanford. John D. Rockefeller. And some of you may have a friend or two who tried to get into, or maybe did get into the University of Chicago in 1889. And so the University of Chicago in 1889 is endowed with a good chunk of Rockefeller money. Some of the most prominent names in universities in America that were established in the post-Civil War era were established as scientific beacons, established as different and German models of higher education. And so those are just some of the ideas and the ways that you're seeing this society change. In some respects, you maybe have been able to foretell it prior to the Civil War, but in many respects, you probably couldn't. So here we are, the Civil War, again, coming back from the start of the semester, here it comes again. The Civil War changing and profoundly affecting society in ways we would not have imagined. So, it's a good place to stop for this lecture. Thank you.